Welcome again to Real Crusades History. This is J. Stephen Roberts, and this is going to be another podcast in my series on the 11th century. And basically, I'm coming to a close in this look at the rise of the Latin West over the course of the mid to late 11th century in an almost anticipation of the First Crusade. So we've already talked about what was going on in Spain. We've talked about the rise of the Normans in southern Italy and their incredible conquest of parts of Sicily. And today I want to follow up on that a bit. We discussed last time the great Norman victory at Sicily, the Battle of Cerami, in which Roger of Hauteville defeated a very large Arab coalition army. Now I want to zoom in a bit on Roger and talk about who he was, how he came to be a prominent figure in Norman southern Italy and Sicily. So, Roger of Hauteville was the landless youngest son who became Count of Sicily one day. He was the youngest son of Tancred of Hauteville, and he was born in Normandy. So this made him the younger brother of Robert Guiscard, who'd come to such prominence in southern Italy. So Roger, wanting to capitalize for himself on his brother Robert's great success in southern Italy, arrived in Italy in 1057 to join his brother. And it was quite recently that his brother Robert had become Count of Apulia. Roger was about 25 years old at this time, and he had a personality that was quite different from his brothers. Robert Guiscard was a calculating, rather distant personality. He came across as arrogant. He wasn't especially likable to his men, whereas on the other hand, Roger had a sunny and merry disposition. He was given to being the life of the party. He was a very popular, sort of dashing figure among his men. We can see how these qualities that Roger possessed made Robert perhaps a bit suspicious of him and wanted to sort of keep his ambition in check. Now, Roger's own chronicler, Geoffrey, a Benedictine monk, leaves us a very interesting description of Roger. Now, Geoffrey must be considered Geoffrey Malaterra, as he is known. He must be considered a highly partial chronicler on behalf of Roger. He was Roger's biggest fan, if you will, among the chroniclers from this period. But nevertheless, while his description of Roger needs to be taken, with that in account, he nevertheless is a very good source for us, and his description of Roger is echoed in other sources we have. So this is Geoffrey Malaterra. Roger was a handsome youth, tall and well-built. He was very ready of speech, but his joyous and open manner was controlled by a calculating prudence. Brave and valiant himself, he was fired by the ambitions proper to his years, and he sought by means of lavish gifts and favors to collect a party of adherents who would be devoted to furthering his fortunes. So, yeah, in a lot of ways, Roger is kind of the prototypical up-and-coming Norman lord, if you will, or wannabe lord. He's attracting a group of guys around him with his magnanimity and his skill as a fighter, and he's got ambitions. He wants to be a great man himself, and his brother Robert is taking note of that, and it's going to definitely cause some strain in their relationship. So, when Roger arrived, he aided his brother Robert Guiscard in the conquest of Calabria. Roger set up a castle called Mileto, from whence he could harass the old Roman road to Reggio. Nevertheless, a dispute began to develop between Robert and Roger. Robert would not grant Roger a proper fiefdom of his own, a proper landholding of his own. Robert, in fact, expected Roger to eke out his own living at Mileto, much as Robert had had to do when he first arrived as a landless, struggling knight in southern Italy. However, Roger was not happy with this at all. He felt that because of the aid he was giving to his brother, he should get a greater share in the conquests. He wanted his brother to grant him his own holdings for himself. And a big part of this was that Roger was a man who wanted to be married. He, in fact, had a well-to-do Norman lady waiting for him back home by the name of Judith, and he was eager to marry her and make her a proper lady on her own lands in southern Italy. And of course, the idea was very strong at this point that you couldn't really make a proper marriage as an up-and-coming young knight if you didn't have some sort of lands with which to share with your lady. So Roger was not happy, and he was willing to exert force to let his brother know this. And in fact, he formed an alliance with one of his other brothers, William. William was the Count of Principata, and William apparently also was not too thrilled with his brother Robert. Robert had a habit of annoying his brothers who came down there to help him out. So William and Roger struck a little deal with one another. William gave to Roger a castle called Scalea at the south end of the Bay of Policastro, from which Roger could effectively harass Robert's lands. So all through early 1058, we have this little civil war between Roger and William against their brother, Robert Guiscard. And of course, who suffered the most in this conflict? Well, the local peasantry, of course. There was wanton violence as the two sides pillaged back and forth. Merchants were abducted for ransom. And on top of that, there was a drought going on. So the local people really suffered. This must have been just an absolutely horrifying thing to live through. We can imagine that if you were a local peasant in that region at the time, you would not have felt warmly about the Hauteville brothers. Now, things got so bad that there was, in fact, an uprising by the local population at Nicastro. The Norman garrison there was slaughtered, and there indeed started to develop some unrest throughout the lands controlled by the Hauteville brothers. So at this point, Robert and Roger realized that their little feud was causing them very serious problems. Indeed, it was threatening the entire establishment that had been created there by the Normans. So they agreed to reconcile. Now, later on, Robert and Roger would come to an agreement that would be basically make them 50-50 partners. But at this point, Robert was still not willing to do that. He came to an agreement with Roger that was still not that favorable toward Roger. They agreed to a 50-50 split of the revenues of Calabria, but still, Robert was not willing to grant Roger control of any territory. And in particular, he wasn't going to give him control of any new conquests. Robert Guiscard was famously stingy with giving up control of land. Like he was often more willing to share loot and revenues with his brothers than he was actually to hand over control of land, because he understood that that's where the real power lay. Now, we can imagine that Roger was not particularly thrilled with this, but nevertheless, he had to be satisfied with it at this point. Meanwhile, the newly elected Pope, Pope Nicholas II, decided to hold a synod in Norman Melfi, so the Norman-held city of Melfi. Now, this was an incredible thing for the Normans, because the Pope previously had been very much opposed to them, and understandably so. In this early period, they were better as conquerors than they were as governors. They would later become quite good statesmen, but we're still in this early period, and especially in that very early period, even before Robert Guiscard's time, the Normans tended to be a force for chaos in southern Italy, and the popes were not too keen on them. But we can see now that things are starting to change as Norman power is on the rise, and indeed, the Hauteville brothers are beginning to establish a serious state in southern Italy. So Robert and Roger hurried to greet the Pope at Melfi. Roger had in fact just put down a Byzantine-inspired revolt in Garace. Pope Nicholas did something very interesting. He consecrated the new church of Santissima Trinita at Venosa. So this really signaled the end of papal opposition to the Normans. For one thing, the popes themselves needed help, and they needed powerful allies like the Normans. Their conflict with the Holy Roman Emperor was putting them in a position where they definitely needed allies. Now, what's very interesting about this synod at Melfi is that one Cardinal Hildebrand was present. So this cardinal, of course, was going to later become the famous Pope Gregory VII, who was probably the driving force in the Gregorian reform movement that was becoming such an important thing in the church in the late 11th century. So we wonder what Cardinal Hildebrand's conversation with Robert Guiscard must have been like as they met one another, because Hildebrand was one of the important members of Pope Nicholas II's entourage. So Hildebrand, he was a determined moralist. He was someone who wanted the church to have what he saw as its proper authority, its proper power to govern itself, and its proper recognition by Christendom, by the Christian rulers of secular rulers of the various Christian kingdoms. And he was very single-minded in a lot of ways in this respect. And he understood that the papacy had to have the right sort of allies to help realize this vision. And the Normans increasingly would have been looking like an ally who could help with that. Meanwhile, Robert Guiscard, he had sort of a straightforward, simple piety, but he was also rather morally loose. He was very focused on power and wealth and conquest and, ensuring his own power and self-aggrandizement. So we can see how these two men would have understood that they could help each other achieve their ends. So it's too bad that we can't know more about what their interaction must have been like at this synod. The actual church issues discussed at this synod in Melfi probably are not that important to history. What's more important is this burgeoning alliance between the papacy and the Normans. Now, the Pope does something else even more important in his recognition of the Normans. He names Robert Guiscard Duke of Apulia, Calabria, and Sicily. Now, this is an incredible thing. So the Pope is basically saying he's not at all interested in the claims that the Byzantines and the Holy Roman Emperor have in this region. So he's cutting off that avenue. He's sort of burning that bridge, if you will. And he's saying he's putting his faith in the Normans. He's throwing his hat in the ring of the Normans. And on top of that, of course, he's recognizing that the Normans probably have the potential to return Sicily to Christendom. This is something that the Reformed papacy was becoming very interested in, was this idea of reconquest, reconquering territories from the Muslims that were under Muslim control. We know how the Reformed popes were very interested in the Iberian Peninsula. We've talked about that in some of the podcasts in this series already. So the Normans were only too happy to receive this endorsement from the Pope. And in fact, Robert took an oath to the Pope, and I'm going to read the text of that oath right now. I, Robert, by the grace of God and of St. Peter, Duke of Apulia and Calabria, and with the aid of both future Duke of Sicily, shall be from this time forth faithful to the Roman Church and the Apostolic See, and to you, my Lord, Pope Nicholas, I shall do nothing by word or deed whereby you lose life or limb, or be taken captive unlawfully. Nor shall I knowingly betray, to your injury, information which you have entrusted to me, instructing me not to share it. I shall everywhere, and to the best of my ability, help the Holy Roman Church hold and secure the rights of St. Peter and his property against all men. I shall help you hold the Roman papacy securely and honorably. I shall seek neither to invade nor acquire the land of St. Peter and the principality, that's of Benevento, nor shall I presume to plunder them without the clear permission of you or your successors who may enter into the honor of St. Peter, with the exception of what you grant to me or your successors shall grant. I shall endeavor in good faith to see that the Holy Roman Church receives annually the agreed tribute from the land of St. Peter, which I hold or shall hold. All churches which lie under my lordship, with their possessions, I transfer into your power, and I shall defend them in the fealty to the Holy Roman Church, and I shall swear fealty to no one except with the reservation of my fealty to the Holy Roman Church. If you or your successors shall leave this life before me, I shall, in accordance with the instructions I am given by the foremost cardinals, Roman clergy, and laymen, assist in the election and ordination of a pope to the honor of St. Peter. I shall observe all the above in good faith to you and the Holy Roman Church, and I shall observe this fealty to your successors who are appointed to the honor of St. Peter, and who shall have confirmed to me the investiture which you have granted to me. So help me God and his holy gospels. Really interesting there. So basically, now notice how the Pope he wants Robert to swear that he's not going to ever invade or plunder his own land. So I mean, the Norman propensity for plunder and looting is definitely on the Pope's mind. So he wants to hopefully neutralize the possibility of that. But he's laying this out here that Robert is going to be his ally in ensuring the papacy has the political power in the regions that it rules over. Notice that Robert gives over the churches. So this is the big thing in the investiture controversy, was that the church should be independent of secular power. So that means even, the bishoprics that exist within a secular lord's territory, they don't belong to that secular lord. He can't just do whatever he wants with them, elect whoever he wants to be the bishop. He can't just elect his boys to just fill that powerful office as his man. No, the church has to be able to put properly qualified men in those positions. So, Robert's agreeing to that. Now, I'm sure, in these sorts of agreements, Robert knows that the Pope is going to help him get people into those positions that Robert still wants. So, Robert understands the trade-off of what's going on here. Now, in gratitude for what Pope Nicholas had done here, the Normans made good on their promise to ensure that the Pope had his place in Rome. They descended on Rome, and they installed Pope Nicholas there against the opposition of the anti-pope, Pope Benedict, or this guy who's come to be known as anti-pope Benedict in history. They looted the countryside, and they punished the followers of anti-pope Benedict, and they imprisoned him as well. Now, this anti-pope we're talking about here, he's known to history as anti-pope Benedict X, and he essentially had been established as pope by some of the local ruling families and aristocracies of Rome. And this was a big complaint of the church, that the popes were being chosen by powerful Roman families, not by the church. And this is one of the things that the Reformed papacy is hoping the Normans will help them enforce, is that the church herself will be electing the popes, not, just whoever the wealthy family is in Rome. So, fresh off this great endorsement from the papacy, in the 1060s, Robert and Roger begin the conquest of Sicily, which we discuss in more detail in the previous podcast. I will provide a link to that if you want to get into that. During this time, Roger also married the beautiful Judith of Evreux. Their marriage took place in 1062. The pair had met back in Normandy before Roger had departed, and they were so taken with each other that they promised that they would be together and be true to one another. Their marriage was really a love match in an age of political marriages. They were genuinely in love with each other. Judith was the descendant of the Dukes of Normandy, so she had Dukes of Normandy in her ancestry. So not only was she someone that Roger just liked, but she was an advantageous political match for him, a landless youngest son. And in fact, the idea that he would be able to marry her was kind of absurd. It was really only her devotion to him that prevented her from ending up married to a more fitting match. Judith actually took up a position as a novice sister to avoid being married off by her relatives to a better suitor, a man with lands and titles of his own. So basically what that means is she took up a position as just sort of the entrant level, position in a community of sisters. She hadn't taken any, permanent vows or anything yet. So she was kind of there to hide out for the time being until Roger could get to her. And it was actually Robert himself who made some arrangements that resulted in Judith coming to southern Italy. What happened was that Judith's family fell out of favor with the Duke of Normandy, and so Robert offered them refuge in his holdings, and this resulted in Judith showing up in southern Italy, and that's when she and Roger were married. Did Robert have something to do with helping his brother achieve this marriage that he'd so longed for? Well, we don't know that for certain, but we do know that Robert's actions did result in putting Judith in a position to marry Roger. So in 1063, Roger wins this great battle of Cerami against an Arab coalition in Sicily, basically securing the Norman presence in Sicily. So this is really where I want to pick up. If you remember, I did a very extensive podcast about the Battle of Cerami, which you can check out if you want the details about that. But what I would like to talk about now is Roger's course of action, and indeed his brother Robert's course of action in Sicily in the aftermath of this great victory at Cerami. So the Pisans took note of the Norman victory at Cerami, and they began to look at the possibility of a major attack on Palermo, the great Muslim-held trading port in Sicily. So this was the great power center of Muslim Sicily. And the Pisans could see now, with this Norman presence on the northern half of Sicily, that perhaps an attack could be made, that Palermo could be vulnerable. And this could be quite profitable for the Pisans as well as for the Normans. So they proposed like a joint operation. The Pisans would use their navy to attack Palermo by sea. Meanwhile, the Normans would attack from the land. So they proposed this to Roger when he was at Troina, this idea of a joint assault. Roger, however, he knew that his army was simply not large enough at this point to engage in a major land operation against Palermo, even with Pisan naval support. The Normans really did not have the naval capabilities whatsoever at this point to do something, to attack from sea. So Roger declines at this point. The Pisans do, in fact, though, carry out a little raid of their own. Nothing terribly substantial, but they do raid Palermo, and this is something that is possible now. We have this situation now where there's a Christian hold on Sicily, and so Palermo is much more vulnerable than it used to be. So if we look at the situation of Palermo at this point, this is one of the great cities in the region, without question. It has a population of over 250,000. Only Constantinople and Cairo are richer at this point. It boasts 500 mosques, 150 butchers. It is an absolutely sprawling city. It has a total of 5 quarters, 2 of them fortified, the commercial town and the port, and the official city, with the arsenal and the naval basin. The coastal plain that lays out behind Palermo is incredibly fertile, with these just lush gardens and farms, and this plain is defended quite easily, in fact, on the landward side by a very rough mountain range. So only a very, very large and well-equipped army would even be able to approach Palermo. So the Hauteville brothers know that they're not ready yet for a major attack on Palermo. However, they decide that they're going to test Palermo's defenses. So they decide to launch sort of a reconnaissance type campaign, a campaign that's really aimed towards probing Palermo. Now, of course, if they happen to manage to conquer the city, they'd be quite happy to do that, but they really weren't expecting to do that at this point. So Robert joined his brother Roger in Sicily with a fairly large army in the summer of 1064. And combined with Roger's men, this made up the largest Norman force that had yet been deployed in Sicily. So this was a considerable expedition, no doubt about it. So they were perhaps preparing to, if the opportunity arose, they might be ready to in fact conquer Palermo. They marched unopposed south and then along the north coastal route, which eventually came to be called the Way of the Franks. So the Road of the Franks, because they raided from this direction so often. They camped in this mountainous, hilly region behind the coastal plain of Palermo, called the Conca de Oro, where they faced some very stiff resistance. The Muslims of Palermo struck out to attack the Normans, and they were well equipped to do this. So there was some very serious fighting, and the Normans they didn't have an easy time at this. Both sides fought pretty hard. There was also some back and forth skirmishing, but the Normans remained in the area for about 3 months. So they pressed Palermo for around 3 months. They collected some booty, nothing terribly substantial, and then they headed home. And again, the main point of this was intelligence gathering. This was a bit of a mission to see what Palermo was like. And of course, we know that this was something that the Normans were pretty famous for. Robert, this is something he liked to do. He liked to kind of size things up, size up the situation. However, one of the most difficult aspects of the campaign was that, in fact, while they were camped in the hills of the Conca de Oro, they suffered bites from some spiders, which are described in the sources as tarantulas. And these spider bites were very painful and just really created some serious discomfort for the Norman troops camped there. So not a good time at all during this little campaign. It was a rough campaign indeed, and the Muslims of Palermo defended their city quite bravely. So with this campaign concluded, Robert had a lot of stuff to attend to back in Italy, and so he left his brother Roger in charge of the Norman holdings in Sicily. And again, Roger only had a few hundred knights at his disposal, so he wasn't able to do much in terms of expanding his conquests. He was fairly limited in the activities he could engage in during this period, and this was difficult for Roger because he was quite ambitious. He was eager to really take control of more territory in Sicily. Basically, what he had to do was engage in a war of attrition, if you will. But the Normans were in firm control of the Val d'Amone. Meanwhile, they had some somewhat friendly Arabs who occupied Catania and Syracuse. So these were the successors of Ibn Timna, who had been Roger's original Arab ally against Ibn Awas back when Roger first invaded the island. So these Arabs in that region were fairly friendly to the Normans, or far more so to the bulk of Muslim Sicily. The interior and west of the island, the western part of the island of Sicily, was solidly under Muslim control. The Christian locals had a mixed reaction to the Normans. There were some of them who were more favorable to them, some of them who were less favorable to them. But we have to remember too, that, as I talked about in a previous podcast, when Roger subdued Troina, he was very rough on the local population. The propensity for the Normans to pillage rather wantonly, this oftentimes turned local populations against them. However, Roger was able to build up his strength and his coffers by frequently raiding Muslim-held territory. And in fact, by the mid-1060s, he could mostly raid throughout the island of Sicily unopposed. So his men were free to kind of terrorize the countryside with little opposition from the local Muslim emirs. In fact, the local Muslim lords grew accustomed to simply paying off the Normans for the most part. Now, this certainly softened up the local Arab establishments, but this was unlikely to result in the conquest of the rest of the island. So these Muslim lords were still very much in control of these major cities like Palermo. So the only thing that was ultimately going to allow the Normans to decisively conquer the whole of the island was going to be a major military campaign, which would have to be launched again at some point in the future. Now, one of the reasons the local Muslim rulers were not very good at opposing the Normans or checking their rating was because of infighting among the Muslims. So we remember last time that there were some Berbers from Tunisia who had helped the local Arab rulers of Sicily in their coalition against the Normans. This is what happened at Cerami. But very quickly, after this great Norman victory at Cerami, this relationship fell apart. And so there was a lot of tension between the Tunisian faction and the local Arab dynasties. In particular, the former allies, Ayyub, who was from Tunisia, and Ibn Hawas, who ruled most of interior Sicily, they were now at odds with each other. So they were actually struggling with one another for control of Sicily. And in 1067, in fact, they fought a major battle with one another. And it was really a disaster for Muslim Sicily because there's a lot of deaths. And in fact, Ibn Hawas himself was killed. So this was important. Ibn Hawas had been somebody who could kind of stand up to the Normans. He's taken out of the picture at this point. And now the Tunisian faction, led by Ayyub and his brother Ali, are now in the position of trying to subdue the unwilling local Arab aristocracies in Sicily. So, again, this is not a good situation for resisting the Normans. This all works toward the advantage of the Normans. In 1068, Ayyub decided that he was going to try to secure himself as the ruling figure in Sicily. He was going to try to override the resistance to him from some of the local Arab families, the local aristocratic Arab families, and he was going to position himself as the champion of Islam in Sicily, and he was going to do this by decisively attacking the hated Normans. So that summer, the summer of 1068, he organized a very large army once again, and he headed out to attack the Normans. Now, he in fact caught the Normans during one of their characteristic raiding expeditions. Roger and a fairly small cavalry of his knights were engaged in a raid, and they realized that the Arabs were marching on them, that this large Arab and Berber coalition was marching on them under Ayyub. Now, the smart thing to do probably would have been to withdraw, or at least the prudent thing. Maybe that's not the right word, smart, but the prudent thing would probably have been to withdraw. But Roger was an incredibly bold individual. Remember at Cerami, he was quite outnumbered. And in this case here, he was very outnumbered, but Roger was also one of those leaders who inspired his men. His men were, his enthusiasm was infectious, and he wanted to stand and face off against this large Muslim army. And so the two armies met about 10 miles southeast of Palermo. Now what this was the famous Battle of Misilmeri. And at this battle, the Arabs were once again totally defeated. So this Berber Arab coalition was smashed. The Muslims were defeated. Once again, it was the Norman cavalry charge that was decisive. Roger and his knights were very good at this, and they smashed the Muslim lines. This was a total victory once again for the Normans. And what this resulted in was the collapse of Zirid Tunisian rule. So the Tunisian faction pretty much collapsed in Sicily. Their legitimacy was gone. They'd been defeated by the Normans again. And in fact, Ayyub and his supporters withdrew. They retreated from Sicily. They left the island. And there was really no prominent Muslim leader who emerged to fill that vacuum. So once again, things were going the way of the Normans. And Palermo, in fact, now was within Norman grasp. It really no longer had the Tunisian support that had really helped protect it. And at this point, it's very vulnerable to the Normans. I'd like to take a moment now to say thanks to my latest Patreon supporter, Vincent. Vincent pledged $5 monthly. Thanks very much, Vincent. And Vincent also has a pretty cool channel himself with some good music. I'm going to link to it in the information box below this podcast if you guys want to check it out. And if you want to become a Patreon supporter, you get access to exclusive podcasts that are not available to the public, and also you get access to the entire back catalog of Real Crusades History's podcasts in MP3 format. All you have to do is, once you become a Patreon supporter, just send me a private message, and I will send you that entire folder, which is just chock full of just historical content from Real Crusades history, and it all becomes yours for your hard drive. So head on over to Patreon. Now, after this incredible victory that Roger won in Sicily, his second major field battle victory against the Muslims of Sicily, well, Robert Guiscard went on to capture Bari. Now, Bari was one of the last truly important holdouts of the Byzantines in southern Italy, and this was a major turning point in the Norman conquest of the entire region. Essentially, the Byzantine garrison was expelled, but Robert did something very important with the conquest of Bari, and that is he granted the population incredibly generous terms. Now, as we've talked about before, the Normans had a tendency to plunder, to loot. When they'd capture a city or something like that, the commander would allow the knights to just go wild, looting the town, and this created incredible hostility in the local population, and certainly understandably so. So the Normans were going from being kind of these armed thugs who rode around conquering through terror and just through sheer brute force, to now they were becoming statesmen. So Robert Guiscard was becoming a statesman. He granted the population very generous terms. He basically allowed them to keep all of their previous arrangements, the mechanisms for government that they already had in place. They simply now had a Norman superstructure over them. And in fact, he won the population over. In fact, there was a lot of relief among the population because they were expecting the usual rough, horrific treatment that they would receive. And in fact, this really allowed Robert to win the population over. And this was going to become a pattern for the Normans in the future, as we'll see. This was an important lesson they were learning. And indeed, as this kingdom that they establish, which is going to become one of the most prosperous and powerful kingdoms of the High Middle Ages, this Kingdom of Sicily, it's going to be marked by this high quality of statesmanship, but it certainly had rough and violent beginnings. So, with Bari now under the control of the Normans, Robert Guiscard and Roger decided that now was the time for a major attack on Palermo. It was time to move decisively on this most important city in Sicily. And so, Robert and Roger began building a very large-scale coalition, and it truly can be called a coalition for this invading force that was going to attack Palermo, because it did not just include Normans. It also included many of the Greeks, Lombards, Italians, who now were coming under Norman rule in southern Italy. And in fact, Robert was now going to be taking advantage of the maritime talents of many of the Greeks and Italians that he was now ruling over. At Bari, he had established a fairly effective fleet, which had enabled him to capture this city. Well, that's going to continue. So the Normans are going to launch a very substantial and effective fleet indeed that is going to help them with this assault on Palermo. And in doing that, they are absolutely taking advantage of the naval skills of the Greeks and Italians. So this is not just a Norman army. This is a coalition army. It includes Greeks, Italians, and it's around 10,000 in number. So it's absolutely massive. This is an incredible thing we're looking at here, and we can see how far the Normans have come from just being some landless knights, showing up, acting as mercenaries in southern Italy, starting to carve out a few little territories for themselves, to now, they're ruling over this vast and important part of the Mediterranean world, and they're able to build this massive coalition army. So it's quite striking. So this attack on Palermo is set to begin in 1071, just 4 months after the fall of Bari. And as we remember, Robert Guiscard had ingratiated himself with the citizenry of Bari by granting them such generous terms. And so now a lot of these guys who had been fighting against him when he was attacking that city, well, now they're going to be joining him in this expedition against Palermo. So there's more than just to just building the trust of that community in Bari. Well, now they're going to help him with this major expedition. Now, in preparing this attack on Palermo, Robert and Roger were concerned about the possibility of the heirs of Ibn Timna, who ruled this more eastern part of the island, deciding to turn on them ultimately and become less friendly toward the Normans. And if they saw, an impending collapse of Palermo, which would signal, this definite rise of Norman power in Sicily, well, they might, prove not to be so, friendly with the Normans as they had been in the past. And if you look at a map of Sicily, you can see that Catania, which is one of these cities on the eastern coast, it is kind of in a position to come up behind an army that's attacking Palermo and creating some trouble for it. And so Robert wanted to secure Catania before the attack on Palermo began. So what he did is he actually he executed a ruse against the Muslim rulers of Catania. He told them that he planned to raid Malta. So he showed up with some ships and said, hey, I'm going to launch a raid on Malta. I need a port to use for that. And again, in the past, there'd been fairly friendly relations between the Normans in this part of Sicily, and between the Normans and the Muslims in this part of Sicily. And so the Catanians were like, okay, well, that sounds fairly reasonable to us. And so they allowed Robert the use of their port. Well, once Robert was there, he basically took over the town very quickly without, they basically let him in, not really thinking that this could be some sort of a trap. And so he took advantage of the past friendly relations that had, or maybe friendly is too strong a word, warmer relations that had existed between this part of Muslim Sicily and the Normans, and took control of Catania. So very typical of Robert Guiscard, wiliness, if you will. Guiscard means sly. It means wily. It means, somebody who you've got to watch out for his cunning. Well, here's Robert, once again living up to his nickname. So, with Catania secured, Roger now approaches Palermo via Troina with his land-based cavalry. Meanwhile, Robert approaches Palermo with the navy by sea. And while that's happening, Serlo, their nephew, with a Norman force, is going to be protecting their rear. So he's going to be acting as a buffer against any attacks that might come from other parts of Muslim Sicily. So Roger essentially advances unopposed, and he camps in the gardens outside of the city. So this is far different than the situation when he first attacked Palermo, where he had to kind of camp up in the mountains. Meanwhile, Robert arrives with the fleet. And in this way, they set up a blockade. Roger blockades the city from the land. Robert tries to close off the harbor from any approaching Muslim ships. Now, meanwhile, the Muslims inside of Palermo are prepared. They have been expecting this. So they have been reinforcing the walls. They have been storing up weapons and supplies. So there was some very hard fighting along the walls of Palermo. The Muslim garrison fought extremely hard, and the Normans fought back equally with incredible vigor, and this went on for several months. There was a major setback, however, for the Muslims of Palermo when a relief navy of Muslim ships was crushed by the Norman navy. So this essentially eliminated, in fact, the naval power of Muslim Sicily. And this naval victory for the Normans, it pretty much cut Palermo off entirely from the outside world, because they certainly no longer had the support of Tunisia. They did not have anyone who was going to bring them aid by sea, which of course was probably the route that would be most directly beneficial to them in resupplying the garrison. The land route was certainly cut off by Roger's forces, so Palermo was really in a difficult situation. There was a bit of a stalemate that followed, wherein both sides knew that there was going to have to be a decisive battle to determine what was going to happen, and Robert is the one who ended up forcing the issue. That January, he launched a major assault on Palermo. Now, as the Norman knights attacked the walls, the Muslims decided to not allow that. They didn't want to allow the Normans to just directly assault the walls. They wanted to ride out and fight them in the field. So that's the situation we were in. At this point, the defenses of Palermo were reduced. The resources of the garrison were stretched quite thin, and so they really needed they needed a field victory against the Normans to really effectively protect Palermo from them at this point. And so that's the point of this sortie out of the city. I know sometimes, look, for us, from the modern world, looking back on these medieval events and these sieges, we find the idea of a sortie out of the city kind of crazy. It's like, well, how could you do that? But it oftentimes was effective, because you've got a place to which you can retreat right behind you, and meanwhile you're denying the enemy the ability to just focus on battering down your defenses. So you're kind of, you do have the possibility of escape, but you can also sort of bring the situation to a head. You can force the enemy to fight you like in the field. Now, as we've learned from the past here, in these podcasts we've been doing about the Norman conquest of Sicily, this was not really the best idea, I think, ultimately, because the Norman cavalry was just very good. And in this situation, the coastal plain here gave them plenty of opportunity for a charge, and that's what happened. The Normans execute. Roger leads this charge against the attacking forces from Palermo, and he smashes them. He just delivers a crushing defeat right there out in front of Palermo. And a very the thing that happens next is really pretty rough. The Muslim commanders back in Palermo decided to shut the gates of the city against their own men at this point. So the men who had gone out bravely in this sortie against the Normans, now they're retreating because they've just been defeated by the Normans, and they're wanting to get back into the city. Well, the garrison commanders, they shut the gates, and they won't allow these men to come back in. So they're basically slaughtered there. They're trapped and they're slaughtered by the Normans right there in front of the walls. Incredibly demoralizing for the Muslims inside of Palermo. But at this point, the garrison commanders thought, there was a chance, if they had allowed the army to retreat inside, that the Normans could have overwhelmed them and gotten into the city. So they thought they had to do this. They've got to shut up the city and sacrifice these guys outside the walls to hopefully protect the city against the Normans. With this having happened, the remaining Muslim defenders of Palermo are now desperately trying to hold the walls against the Normans. And Robert, meanwhile, decides he wants to seek some way to bring this thing to a head. So he looks for an alternate point of attack on Palermo. And he selects what is called the lower section of the city. So remember, we talked about the two fortified sections of Palermo. Well, he suspects that the lower section of the town is poorly defended at this point, because again, resources are stretched thin. This portion of the city is called the Caliza. It's the administrative center. It also contains the arsenal, and it contains the emir's magnificent palace. So, Robert leaves Roger with the bulk of the army, and meanwhile he takes a picked force to attack the Calisa. And in truth, he found that it was poorly defended. The Normans are able to scale the walls and penetrate the city fairly quickly, at which point there's panic throughout the remaining Muslim defenders of Palermo, and there is an attempt to eject the Normans from the city. There is fierce street fighting. So this is the kind of fighting, imagine the narrow streets in a medieval city. This is hand-to-hand fighting. But what happens when the dust settles is the Muslims still are able to pretty much control the upper town, but the Normans have gained the lower town. They now have a very good toehold on Palermo at this point. So here's the situation now. The Muslims are pretty much out of options. And they're also quite frightened, I'm sure, because they know what's coming, or they think they know what's coming. They are going to face the full wrath of the Normans. I'm sure they're thinking, total sacking of the city, people being sold into slavery, all of that. But nevertheless, there's nothing they can do at this point. They are trapped in the upper town. They have no hope of driving out the Normans who now control part of Palermo, and they have no hope of receiving any aid from outside. So they can do nothing but pretty much sue for peace. Essentially what they're doing is throwing themselves on Robert's mercy. Now, Robert surprises them. He offers them very generous terms. And this is really remarkable. This is an age when a fierce resistance to a besieging army that then is able to get inside of the city is probably going to result in that city being brutally sacked, people being sold off into slavery, that kind of thing. And especially when we're dealing with two different religions, when it's a Muslim army versus a Christian army, or vice versa. But Robert doesn't do that. This is kind of part of his new policy. This is how he is helping to build up his territory. So he doesn't allow the sacking of the town, and this didn't sit too well with a lot of the Italians and Greeks and of course the Normans in his army. I mean, the Normans were his Norman knights were just eager for plunder and conquest whenever they could get it, but there was sort of a grudge on the part of the Christians who'd been living in Italy for quite some time. For some 250 years, Muslim piracy had been plaguing Italy, and a lot of these Christians, they were in no mood for mercy, and they kind of viewed this whole showdown at Palermo as, okay, finally we're really gonna stick it to them. We're gonna make them pay for this long period where they've been terrorizing Italian shores. But Robert Guiscard doesn't allow that. He doesn't really allow that extraction of revenge. He allows the Muslims to retain all of their property, so there's not going to be any plundering, beyond what's already happened in the fighting back and forth. He allows them to retain their Muslim faith, and he allows them to pretty much continue as a self-governing subject population inside of Palermo. They are required, of course, to return the ancient basilica to the Christians, and they also have to submit to Robert's rule and to his taxation. Now, the fact is, though, the Muslim citizens of Palermo were absolutely delighted with these terms. They couldn't believe it. They were expecting the worst. In fact, news of this spreads, and some other nearby fortresses just voluntarily surrender to Robert, after learning of the types of terms that he was granting at Palermo. They're reading the course of things. The Normans are certainly on the rise in Sicily, and they want to get ahead of the situation and go ahead and just submit to the true power in the region. So Robert Guiscard and his brother Roger entered Palermo in triumph on January the 10th, 1072. There was a great mass celebrated in the newly consecrated Basilica of Santa Maria, and it was led, in fact, by a Greek Rite bishop and Greek clergy. Robert and Roger basked in their victory. They were now the key power in this region of southern Italy and Sicily. And this is a remarkable thing. We have to think about what has happened here. When Robert Guiscard showed up in southern Italy, he was a landless minor knight, essentially, acting as a mercenary, as a local robber baron. And now he has ascended to this point of being a major power in the Mediterranean. He is he has founded what is going to be one of the great kingdoms of the medieval world. He and Roger together have founded this. Now, Roger is now going to essentially be, while he's going to be nominally under Robert as ruler of Sicily, he is essentially going to be allowed free reign as an independent ruler in Sicily. And indeed, he's going to prove to have quite a talent for that. Again, Robert and Roger are emerging as statesmen. And this is one of the features of the Kingdom of Sicily, is that it contains a wide variety of peoples. It's got Greek Rite Christians, it's got Latin Christians, it's got Muslims in it. But these peoples are all going to live quite well in the Kingdom of Sicily. And the court of the Norman court at Sicily is going to prove to be one of the truly remarkable courts in all of medieval Europe. The brothers generously endowed both the Latin and Greek churches in the region, so they didn't, come in and just, bowl over the Greek rite or anything like that. They were generous with both the Latin and Greek clergy. So this is, again, noteworthy in the types of statesmen they were becoming. So with that, I conclude my discussion of Roger of Sicily and the conquest of Sicily by the Normans. Hope you guys enjoyed this podcast series, and I hope you enjoyed everything I've done so far about the late 11th century and the rise of the Latin West. As I'm concluding this podcast series, and this podcast here concludes that series, I would invite you to check out my documentary about the First Crusade. So that's the big event that comes after, as we get the rise of the Latin West in Spain and in Sicily. The First Crusade comes after that. So check that out. And then I'm going to continue sort of in a chronological manner here, looking at the history of the Crusades. After you've watched my documentary about the First Crusade, by then I should have up a podcast I'm going to be doing about the Crusade of 1101. So that's the crusade that happened in the immediate aftermath of the First Crusade. So I hope you guys will enjoy that. So thanks very much for listening. I'll talk to you soon.